Good afternoon, everyone. I am so excited to be here with you all this afternoon for the second in our series of enlightenment through engagement. And this is a very special discussion that we're going to have today. It's obvious based upon the faces before you that we have an all-star lined up gathered for this afternoon's conversation regarding law enforcement and community policing reform. Uh, because we have such an ambitious agenda, you're not going to hear Robert, blabbering on for Robert's usual blabber period. I am going to be very, very brief this afternoon. Today, we are so excited to announce that this conversation is in partnership with our one and only former president of the Florida Bar, Eugene Pettis, and his Can We Talk series. We are co-hosting today's discussion with Gene and Can You Talk. Gene Pettis is not a stranger to any of us who are attending this afternoon. And Gene has been in the trenches for quite a while, working on issues of social and community import. I'll give you a brief intro to Gene, introduce the panel members, introduce some sponsors, and then we'll get right into it. There is one housekeeping rule, and that one housekeeping rule is the rule that has governed and guided our discussions and will guide our discussions for the rest of the year as we go through them. And that is, this is a safe space. A space where we have hard-hitting, meaningful conversations, free from partisanship, free from divisive politics. It's a space where facts matter. So with that, my co-moderator, Mr. Gene Pettis, co-founder of Halliser, Pettis and Schwam, who leads a trial practice representing an impressive list of corporate, public sector, and individual clients in civil trial matters. Gene attended the University of Florida, where he received his bachelor's degree in political science in 1982 and his JD in 1985. In 2013, Mr. Pettis became the first African-American president of the Florida Bar. In his role at the helm of the bar, he provided visionary leadership and brought a passion for giving back to his profession and his community. This year, Eugene announced his most recent initiative, the Can We Talk dialogue series, aimed at encouraging meaningful, positive dialogue amongst community stakeholders to bring about change. We're going to introduce our panel members, and I will say with a very, very brief apology to all of them and a thank you to all of them, because as I was mentioning to them earlier, we could spend the entire morning introducing these folks based upon their experiences, their accomplishments, and their credentials. They have graciously allowed me to truncate their introductions so that we can get to the meat of the conversation and get to exactly what it is you want to hear from them. So without any further ado, I will begin with Broward County Mayor Dale Holness. Dale Holness is the mayor of Broward County and has been since 2019. He was born in Jamaica, and after immigrating to the United States, he attended and graduated from Plantation High School, and he earned his associate's degree from Broward College in Davie. He is a real estate and mortgage broker and is the co-founder of All Broward Realty. Mayor Holness was elected to the Fort Lauderdale City Commission in 2004. He served as vice mayor of Broward County from 2018 to 19. He was unanimously appointed on November 19, 2019 to serve as the mayor of Broward County, Florida, becoming the second African-American male to serve as the mayor of Broward County. Next up, we have our Broward County Sheriff, Gregory Toney. As Broward County's 17th sheriff and the first African-American to serve in that capacity, Sheriff Toney brings a wealth of experience, a unique skill set and passion for public safety to the Broward Sheriff's Office. Guided by his personal North Star belief that service equals reward, Sheriff Tony has led efforts to revamp the Broward Sheriff's Office and restore trust in the agency by implementing a host of initiatives focused on bolstering training, building stronger community relationships, providing youth with expanded opportunities for success, and ensuring that his employees are held to the highest standards of professionalism and accountability. Sheriff Tony grew up in inner city Philadelphia and learned from an early age that determination and selflessness was what's needed to be an effective law enforcement officer. He experienced firsthand prejudice that existed between minority youth and law enforcement, and he knows personally the differences that must be made in order to change negative perceptions of law enforcement. He's used his experiences as a launching pad to implement forward-thinking policies to better connect with the many diverse communities served by the sheriff's offices and the law enforcement officers that he leads. Help me welcome Chris Lagerbloom, the city manager from the city of Fort Lauderdale. Chris Lagerbloom became the city manager of the city of Fort Lauderdale, Florida on January 1st, 2019. As city manager, Mr. Lagerbloom is responsible for the day-to-day operations of our wonderful city of Fort Lauderdale that we know and love. City Manager Lagerbloom began his career with the city of Fort Lauderdale in February 2016 as the assistant city manager. He previously served as the city manager of Milton, Georgia, a municipality incorporated in 2006. Prior to being named the city manager in Milton, Mr. Lagerbloom served as interim city manager from 2007 to 2008. He earlier served in the police department in the city of Alpharetta, Georgia, where he worked his way up the ranks from police officer to police captain. Mr. Lagerbloom's professional and civic affiliations include being recognized as both a Paul Harris Fellow and a member of the Paul Harris Society of the Rotary International. Mr. Lagerbloom holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Criminal Justice from Georgia State University and a Master of Public Administration's degree from Columbus State University. Welcome, Mr. Lagerbloom. Next, allow me to introduce Ms. Jasmine Rogers Shaw. Ms. Rogers Shaw was born and raised in South Florida. She's a child of immigrants and was raised with a heart dedicated to service and justice. She describes herself as existing at the intersections of racial and gender justice, and she has worked for several years on advancing legislation that centers around Black women, co-creating curricula that makes the political process accessible, and building a base for women of color committed to reproductive justice. In her spare time, not that there is much of it, she also founded Folding Chair Consulting, aimed at equipping Black women to run for office and win. She serves on the Broward County Commission on the Status of Women and as policy chair on the board of directors for Ruth's List Broward. Her mission, her goal, her calling is to uplift the voices and leadership of Black women as a means to balance the playing field for all people. Next, allow me to welcome, please, Chief Sonia Quinones, the Chief of Police in the city of Hallandale Beach. Chief Quinones is the Chief of Police for her fair city. Her career with the agency began in 1993. She has held the positions of officer, sergeant, captain, and major. Talk about working your way up the ranks. Chief Quinones has 26 years of experience in law enforcement and over 16 years of experience in executive leadership that includes selecting, mentoring, placing, and training future law enforcement executives for success. She is capable and competent and qualified to advise on all stages of law enforcement operations, administration, training, accreditation, and grant management. Chief Quinones offers a 360-degree perspective of law enforcement agency management with expertise in investigative services, uniformed patrol, training, and administrative operations. Welcome, Chief Quinones. I don't see Captain Moss, who might be having difficulty, but let me just give you a brief overview of Captain Moss's credentials. I'm sure he'll jump on. Captain Moss is a Miami native who grew up in Overtown and served in the Miami Police Department for more than 30 years. He worked in several units throughout his time with the department, mainly in homicide. In 1996, he was appointed to the Public Information Office, where he served as a departmental spokesperson and community liaison. In 2008, he became commander of the PIO, the Public Information Office. Captain Moss left South Florida in 2016 to serve as the police chief in Ferguson, Missouri, following the shooting of Michael Brown. Brown's death sparked national outrage as well as protests and unrest. The episode launched the Black Lives Matter movement, or was instrumental therein. Captain Moss was instrumental in leading key reforms in the Ferguson Police Department in the years after the Brown shooting. Next, allow me to welcome H.T. Smith, Esquire. And whenever you say H.T.'s name, it feels like you should be saying the Honorable H.T. Smith before it. It just has a ring. H.T. is the Director of Trial Advocacy Programs at FIU Law. For the past 47 years, Mr. H.T. Smith has practiced law in Miami, specializing in civil rights, personal injury, and criminal defense. His legal career blazed new trails from the beginning. As Miami-Dade's first African-American assistant public defender, and as the Miami-Dade County's first African-American assistant county attorney. And I'm sure HT will correct us and say it wasn't Miami-Dade County at the time, it was simply Miami. HT represented the Public Safety Department, now known as the Miami-Dade Police Department. He was a partner in the first African-American law firm to locate its office in downtown Miami, where the firm represented the Progressive Officers Club of the Miami-Dade Police Department and the Community Police Benevolent Association of the Miami Police Department. HT was the founding president of the Wilkie D. Ferguson Jr. Bar Association and a founding member of the Gwen S. Cherry Black Women Lawyers Association. He also served as president of the Virgil Hawkins Florida chapter of the National Bar Association and the National Bar Association, the oldest and largest bar association for attorneys of color. Welcome, HT. Next, allow me to welcome Chief Dexter M. Williams, the Chief of Police for the city of Miramar. Chief Williams is a native of New York, of Jamaican descent. Yes, I'm partial. I had to put that in. Chief Williams has served in the law enforcement industry for 25 years and has served the citizens of Miramar since 1993. Throughout his tenure, he has served as the commander of several divisions within the police department, including patrol, internal affairs, field training operations, criminal investigations, crime scene property and evidence, domestic violence, victim services, citizen volunteer programs, recruitment, and executive officer to the then chief of police. Chief Williams was appointed assistant chief of police in 2013 and appointed chief in 2016. He currently holds a bachelor's degree in public administration and a master's in management and justice administration, and he is a graduate of the prestigious FBI National Academy. Last but certainly not least, a new friend that I've made, please allow me to introduce Mr. Michael E. Dutko, partner at Dutko and Kroll right here in Fort Lauderdale. Mr. Dutko's experience includes service as a Fort Lauderdale police officer and as an organized crime detective in a former life. He also served as an assistant state attorney. As a founding partner of Dutko and Kroll, Mr. Dutko is regularly listed in the Best Lawyers of America. Additionally, he is recognized as one of America's preeminent attorneys in the U.S. News and World Report. As if this impressive resume and his impressive credentials aren't enough, Mr. Dutko is currently pursuing a PhD in the area of law enforcement organizational leadership with a focus on criminal justice reform, police ethics, and leadership training. I think you will all agree with me when I repeat that this is a group that is going to have a lot to share with us. Before we look, well, I think you all know this. I am your co-moderator, humbly serving as your president of the Broward County Bar Association this year, Robert Vaughn. We can't do this, and we can't have these programs without sponsors, without folks who consistently and reliably support the bar and support all of our efforts. We're going to take a brief moment to say thank you and to recognize those sponsors and then launch into our discussion. So, Lauren, if you could, our sponsor recognition, please.
I'm Eugene Pettis, co-founder of Halleckser, Pettis & Schwab. We are proud to be a sponsor of the Broward County Bar Association's Enlightenment Through Engagement series. 2020 will be notable for many reasons. Among them will be how our generation responded to the call for social justice. At HPS, we pride ourselves on being advocates for justice on behalf of our clients who have been injured or wronged. But we also have a moral obligation to work toward bettering society by making sure that there's equity, opportunity, and inclusion for all people. Margaret Wheatley said, all social change begins with a conversation. So let's talk with authenticity and listen with empathy so that we can live harmoniously as one humanity.
Kim Von Lerner is proud to be a sponsor of this Enlightenment series. This series allows us to discuss the important issues of our time, where in this day and age we are dealing with the 4 pillars of injustice that exist, those dealing with social, economic, education, and legal. These conversations will allow us to engage in a civil dialogue back and forth and do more than just hear each other, but listen. And with that, Kim Von Lerner again thanks you for this very important conversation.
Rookie mistake. Thank you. Thank you to the folks at Kim Von Lerner, to the folks of Halleckser, Pettis & Schwab, and to our sponsors, Collins Foreman, who has been a friend of the bar and a very strong participant in these conversations, and also, I think, a participant in one of Gene's discussions early on, and to our friends over at Kelly Eustall Trial Lawyers. Kelly Eustall, again, a tremendous friend and supporter of the bar, tremendous folks in terms of their social participation. Thank you all for all you do and continue to do. Well, folks, let's get to it. We're going to walk you through some statistics, some data to contextualize this conversation and get us all on the same page regarding why are we here? Why is this something needed that we need to talk about? What's actually happening out there in the world in which we live? So the data, please. Gene, why don't you lead us off in the first set of questions regarding some of that data and, contextualizing what we're going to talk about this morning.
Certainly. One of the first topics that, I appreciated President Vaughn, and thanks so much for the kind introductions and your leadership in this regard. One of the first issues that we need to talk about really is systemic racism and institutional bias. It's at the core. President Vaughn talked about an authentic conversation. So often people want to get to solutions. We want to talk about what we're doing, but I think it's very important that we define what the social discussion is about, because we cannot work toward a solution until we acknowledge truthfully what the problem is. So one of the first foundational discussions we need to have is really about systemic racism. And that's a point in which I have recognized it's often a misunderstood term. It's a term that for some, they get very defensive. When we talk about systemic racism, a lot of people get defensive. So out of the box, before we have a conversation, the term brings negativity into the circle. People feel that when we state from our perspective as people of color, that there is systemic racism, that's somehow a reflection on them personally. That we're calling them racist because we're saying there's systemic racism. So I think it's really important to lay the foundation as to what it's not. When we're talking about systemic racism and institutional bias, we're not saying that everyone in the system is a racist. So we can relax in that regard. That can take some of the heat down. So in the context of this discussion, let's define what we're speaking of is that the term systemic racism, institutional bias, there are systems and institutions that produce racially disparate outcomes. We don't have to bother about why, but we do need to acknowledge that we have systems in place across all sectors of our society, all industries that are racially disparate. We saw that with just a glimpse of what Robert showed for the video. And those racially disparate outcomes, they're regardless of the intentions of the people. We can have good people that are a part of systems that are producing disparities. So it's really important as we go forward in this discussion that we look at this issue honestly, that we look at it without defense. One of the things, if I could have the PowerPoint, Lauren, on page 2, that when we're talking about issues such as police and profiling, when we're, Lauren, if we could have the PowerPoint. When we're looking at policing and profiling, and I'm gonna run through these because of time. Many of you all know, but the statistics of policing and profiling have been studied time and time again over the last 20 years, and even up to 2020, as you see. We look at stop and frisk. You know, when we're dealing with stop and frisk, it's such a small number of people, but we can look back on so many lives that have been lost over the last 5 or so years. It started with simple stop, stops. I stopped you because your tail light was out, and she ends up dead. I stopped you because of this concern, ends up dead. So when we look at the stop and frisk, even though it shows that only 3% of these encounters produce a crime, so 97% of the people are being stopped for no good reason. Nothing was found. There is no crime. There is no charges. It puts police in contact significant with people where there is no crime. You know, the New York Times, and this is after the George Floyd's death, while in Minneapolis, they only make up, people of color only make up 19% of that city and 9% of the police force, which is another issue for a different day, but then 58% of the use of force. 19% of the population gets over half of the use of force. That's a disparate treatment. That cannot be explained through context. That's explained through some culture that's in that police force. When we look at the massive study that was this year and just a few months back, 95 million traffic stops by 56 agencies from 2011 to 18 found that while Black people were much more likely to be pulled over than whites, it's interesting that at nighttime that changed when the officers could not distinguish in race. When they can see who they were pulling over, there's a huge disparity, but at nighttime, they could not see. And that study, which is obviously a huge study, a broad study, the study found that blacks were more likely to be searched once they're stopped. Now you have another contact that we're searching people of color, though whites were more likely to be found with illicit drugs. So the suspicions, whatever they may be, were not bearing out for that disproportionate findings. Flip to the next page, Lauren.
Before we flip, Gene, if we can have Ms. Rogers Shaw and HT and Mike Dutko, from your experience and you know your perspective, what is systemic racism or institutional bias?
I mean, it's exactly what Eugene was talking about. Is the idea that normalized within our systems is this white dominance, this patriarchy, this focus on class, which means that more often than not, rich white men will win or are the standard in a lot of our systems, including policing. And that exactly explains all the statistics that you just said about the reasons why, even though more Black folks are getting arrested, we're finding drugs on more white people. And it's pervasive through every single system, through our media, through education, criminal justice, all of these, our government, all of these different systems collide to create this firestorm against Black people, against people of color, against undocumented people, and are bearing down on us at one time. So I mean, it's something that cannot be denied. And I hope that in this conversation, we could start at that first step to acknowledge that there is systemic racism present in policing. Otherwise, there's not a deep conversation that we can have.
Mr. Smith?
Yeah, as people, white and Black across America, watch the recent killings of Black people by the police, some would draw the conclusion that racism and police action is getting worse, but that's not true. It's just getting filmed. It's been like this for 401 years, and I want to commend the Broward Bar Association as well as Can We Talk for having this conversation. White and Blacks and obviously everybody on this call are members of the same, looking for the same thing. So we need to have this speak bitter truth and radical candor so we can get to the situation. Every time there's a shooting, some people, especially the unions, say that was a bad apple. In my considered judgment, the apple orchard is rotten. So you can have good police chiefs who are really doing the best they can to try to rid their organization of bad cops. But when you have the so-called law enforcement Bill of Rights, you have the collective bargaining agreements, you have it just is so difficult. We have tremendous statistics on that. So good people, a perfect example, not with police, but with judges, is that good judges had to sentence people charged with crack cocaine 100 times more than people charged with powder cocaine. Black powder cocaine was the choice of whites. Crack cocaine was a choice of Blacks. That's systemic. Good judges, as a matter of fact, the judge that I knew would only sentence on Friday because it hurt him so bad to destroy people's lives like that. And so the system itself, not the people. Now, are there some bad people in the system? Yes. Let me finally say this, having represented police and sued police. Most people are good. What we need to do is work to redraw the line for this battle. It shouldn't be police versus the Black community or police, the Latin community. It should be good police and good people on one side and bad police and bad people on the other side. And once we get to the point where good police are not protecting bad police, and when good people in the Black community are not protecting bad people in the Black community, we will make a giant leap toward progress in dealing with this issue of police community relations.
Mike, your thoughts, and then back to you, Gene. You're muted, Mike.
Another rookie mistake, Robert.
Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. To follow up on what H.T. Smith and Eugene talked about, I think it's important to begin this dialogue without calling names and without claiming that all policemen are racist. I think that's a non-starter. Having said that, I think there are clear problems, institutional, cultural issues that need to be addressed that have existed for generations in policing. And as HT just pointed out, there certainly is a common belief that some of the problems that are being seen and broadcast on the news involving police shootings and police treatment of certain people is not new. It's just being filmed. Quite frankly, if I was charting this on a chart, I would say that the Rodney King case in '91 was the first that I was aware of a significant encounter that was filmed without the knowledge of the people involved. And since then, it's become an issue that everyone in policing needs to be aware of. But I think it raises the point. There's something that I've become aware of in my studies and in my reading and in my writing. And that is, I'm at the academy often. I speak to police officers. In fact, Mr. Pettis and I have been invited out there over the years to talk in terms of de-escalation and more citizen police interactions, improving relationships. And sometimes our comments have been received well and sometimes not. And it's the older, more traditional people who tend to buck that. And what I've realized is, in police work, the people that come into the academy, I'm stunned. If you haven't had an opportunity, if you have the opportunity to see it, the attitude, the demeanor, the respect that they all show. And I think they come into the job expecting that they're going to take more of a guardian approach. They're there to protect and to serve. And what I've noticed is there seems to be a transition that happens, and I would invite the people with police experience on the panel to agree if you've seen it. But there seems to be a transition from that idealistic mindset in the academy to the culture of the police department when a young officer makes that transition. And at some point, if not on the first day, if not on the first week, within the first month, that officer is going to hear these words. Forget what they taught you in the academy, kid. Let me show you how we do it on the street. And that begins to be the introduction to a different culture. And I think people are doing that which they've been taught over years and over decades, handing down those lessons. And we've reached a point. I had lunch with a police chief a couple weeks ago who said to me, we need to realize that we need to make some changes within the culture, within the institution of policing. We need to understand that there's a systemic problem, and we need to begin converting our officers from what seems to be the warrior mindset to the guardian mindset. And in that regard, we need to take a more of a public service approach towards servicing the community, as opposed to perhaps a prison guard approach to patrolling certain communities. Therein, I think, lies the problem. Now, I'm speaking from hopefully sort of an academic perspective in what I've learned and what I've read and what I'm researching. But from the practical standpoint, yes, our office represents a lot of police officers, and we often are dealing with after the fact, after the problem. And oftentimes, the discussions behind closed doors involve issues of training, and I had no idea, and things of that sort. So a focus needs to take place not just on the individual officer and the training within the department, but there needs to be some focus on adjusting the culture that exists, that has grown over years and extended over years. Yes, sir.
In that regard, Gene, I stepped on you a while ago. I wonder if you could lead Mayor Holness, City Manager Lagerbloom, and possibly others of your choice through a conversation about the difference between institutional racism, systemic bias, and individual racism and the interplay between those. I know you and I have had conversations about concepts of de-individuation, which Mike just talked about, you know, the movement from this ideal concept when you're going into the academy and then the transition when it comes to, hey, kid, you got to let that go. Maybe you bring the sheriff in on that as well. But Gene.
Certainly, and Mike is absolutely right. It was probably about 100+ cadets, and they could not have been more receptive. Within an hour or so, I got a call from Mike Satt saying, Gene, we've gotten pushback. It started at the level of the instructors who were in the back of the room, and then to the field officers who are on the streets. And that's a real concept. If you all recall, in Minneapolis, the first thing that several of those gentlemen who were involved in the George Floyd death said was, I'm new on the job. He was the guy, Chauvin, who did the killing, was the senior guy. He was the field officer. Let me show you. The question was asked, should we turn him over? No. The deference that's giving from common sense to your classroom teaching to the senior guy is a part of the culture. So I'm going to ask Manager Lagerboom, how do we deal with this? Because we heard your introduction, but you're in a unique position, obviously, being our city manager of Fort Lauderdale. You're the one that hires our police chief for the city of Fort Lauderdale. You're the one that interfaces with the union and all that goes on there. How do you deal with the institutional racism concerns that we have, at the same time advancing reforms for a better day in your job as city manager? And then I also want to hear from the sheriff on this point.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Gene. I appreciate the question. You know, it just took me back 25 years to when Mike was talking about that whole statement of forget what you learned in the police academy, let me show you how to police. And I can tell you 25 years ago, I heard those exact words as I left the police academy, and I'll probably date myself, but it's almost eerily shocking to hear those words still today, that that's been a culture of police work, and one that we have to stop. You're right. I do have the responsibility, and I don't take it lightly, in identifying who leads our law enforcement agency and the culture in which we police in Fort Lauderdale, and how that culture needs to change over time. And I think it's most important that at this point, we've got to get people in uncomfortable situations. They've got to be uncomfortable about the conversation. They've got to be uncomfortably candid in talking about what our institutions are and what they have been and where they need to go. And until we recognize that, yeah, we've got issues we need to solve, and we need to be bold and say, you know, tomorrow's got to be different than today, and the day after that has to be different. But you know, the point of driving immediately to a solution, we're all solution driven, and we'd love to just get there and say, okay, I know exactly what to do. If I do 1, 2, 3, and 4, I'm going to get to 5. And I don't think that as we start to change culture and change the method in which the police and the community interaction happens, you know, that's not a solution-driven concept. It's got to be a conversation along the way, and candidly, it's got to be that uncomfortable conversation so that people are willing to recognize that we do have to make change. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest things I've got going on right now is identifying the next police chief in Fort Lauderdale, and a decision certainly that I don't take lightly, and one that could have a long impact to not only our department and our community. So,
Chris, let me ask you something on that point, and you recognize it. I know you get it. I've spoken to you, and I know your record. How do you deal with the force, not the police force, but the weight of the cultural force, where when people speak out, even your own officers, when they speak out, they feel the wrath of their fellow officers? We see things around the country that if you speak out, we don't have your back. You can be out there in need of a backup. We have around the country instances where those that are not happy that Officer X spoke out or called them out, don't back him up, don't back her up. How do we deal with this type of cultural force to make the type of change that you clearly want to make?
Right, so we have to be brave enough not to tolerate it, and I don't know any other place we could be in circumstances like that. That you know, yes, it's a big organization, and it's a big organization that has a culture and a history and a past and a future, and a bright future, I might add. But we just can't simply tolerate it. And as long as we are willing to not talk about it and allow it to happen, then we're tolerating it. And that's one of the biggest things with the culture in an organization, in our police department. And I'm a big believer that the culture of an organization starts at the top and filters its way through the organization. And that's why I think it's so terribly important that the next leader of this department is one that just simply won't tolerate those types of circumstances where the officer doesn't get the backup that they need. I can tell you in light of some of the events that we had in Fort Lauderdale in late May, I even saw our department begin to divide based upon race within their own culture. And that was something we had to address very quickly and very exactly early on, that after May the 31st, I would hear from officers from time to time, particularly our Black officers, that would say, in the street, I'm not Black enough, and in the department, I'm not blue enough. And, that hurt to hear that, and certainly something that even hurts to say it, to be honest. But it's something that we have to be bold enough that we're willing to say, okay, so you said that, now let's take that and talk about that. Because that certainly can't be the culture that we have within our organization.
Gene, if I can jump in again, I want to invite the sheriff and Mayor Holness, because Chris, you just said something that I've heard several times over. On the street, you're not Black enough, and in the department, you're not blue enough. For the sheriff, it's going to be green enough. But you're both leaders in your respective capacities. You both have that, sting of personal experience, and you both have to maintain the trust, the loyalty of the organizations that you lead. Can you talk to us about how you grapple with these same concepts that City Manager Lagerblum was talking about, initiate change, while at the same time maintaining the loyalty of the folks you're leading? Sheriff, you want to start, and then Mayor Holness?
Sure. Thank you, Robert. I think, where Chris left off is pretty clear in that, roughly 20 months ago, I came into this organization being the first of my kind in terms of being an African-American to be seated here. And before I came in here, I was a historian, and I looked into every facet of the organization, how many different sheriffs have served, how they became sheriffs, the culture that they had established during their administration. And I knew early on that I was going to have to come in and tackle some major challenges, in that, one, I was coming in as an outsider, so to speak, having not served in the organization, but now I was going to be leading up over 5,700 employees. But I've said this before, and I know Eugene and I have been on some different panels. What I wanted to do was to come in and promote from within the organization based on individuals' talents, capabilities, and skill trait, because I thought that would bring the most institutional knowledge into a command circle and make us perform very well. But I also knew the importance of having a diverse command staff that looked like Broward County in all shapes, forms, and facets, from African Americans to Hispanic to Latino to women, and diversify this organization so that when we sat at the administrative table and talked about real community issues, we had the perspective of what was going on in the streets, and understanding that what a Black 15-year-old kid is living with, and how their perception with law enforcement is in a negative light because of what they see on TV and what they have to live with on a daily basis. I say this repeatedly. I'm in 21 months as the sheriff, been Black for 41 years. You can't discount a lifetime versus of experiences based on a position that you held now as a professional. And so what I done was to take my personal experiences, what I knew to be true as a Black man in this country, what I knew to be true as a law enforcement officer in this profession, and then brought those experiences into a leadership table to ensure that we did not forget about the legitimate areas of systemic and institutional racism that most certainly exist in this profession and surely exist in this country. I, to a certain degree, like Chris, I wear the multitude of hats, in that I am not just a law enforcement officer, I'm not just a sheriff, but I'm also managing roughly half of this county's district chiefs. Every single one of my districts have a chief of police. And so when I'm communicating with them, it's important that they get the messaging from the top down in terms of what is our new acceptable culture. Because it wasn't just a matter of changing policies, protocols, and procedures, investing millions of dollars towards public safety, but it was penetrating a culture that had suffered so much institutional and systemic racism that even those good officers, and I think it was Mr. Smith that brought it up, even those good officers who are out there working in the community are naive that some of the practices that they're doing, some of the behaviors that they're exhibiting is a byproduct of what has occurred here for 100+ years. And so when you have to penetrate those things, such as we're not going to allow it to be acceptable for young Black men to have their heads slammed into the ground. We're not going to allow, 80-pound little white girls to be choke slammed. We're not going to allow people to be beaten handcuffs. I end up, unfortunately, having to terminate roughly almost a dozen different employees within my first year in this office. That's a shockwave. That shockwave echoed through this entire agency. And it created that rift of, is he Black, too Black for the agency, because we don't see enough green. He's not doing the traditional things of protect the officers at all costs. He's not standing in front of a microphone and saying, my guys are right. Instead, I stepped up and said when they were wrong.
So if I can ask the mayor, what's your experience and perspective been, as the sheriff was just describing, but in your position from the dais? Did we lose Mayor Holness?
We may have lost him.
Well, you know what, Gene, in the interest of time, why don't you lead us through that conversation, Gene, about how this actually manifests on the street? If I can appoint a personal privilege to kind of contextualize it, where we have different perspectives coming together. So if Jasmine, if you can walk us through the perspective from the view of an activist. How does systemic and institutional bias and racism manifest itself on the street? And then if Gene can lead Chief Williams and Chief Quinones through the other side of that conversation, in terms of from law enforcement. So from the side of the activist, Jasmine, how is it manifested on the street in our day-to-day experience?
Yeah, so number one, I want to address something that Michael said when he said we need to start from the premise that all police are not racist. First of all, nobody said here that police are racist. We talked about systemic racism. And I think that's part of the problem, is a defensiveness immediately out of the gate. Maybe we could have good police officers if they weren't forced to uphold a systemically racist system. And the history of policing is rooted in violence against Black people. So we just need to be very clear about some of those things, that when you talk about the culture bearing down and how you defeat that culture, we're going to have to build a whole new culture around it and reimagine what public safety looks like, not only for police officers, but also for the communities that they're supposed to serve. So that needs to be very clear, that I don't know how we fix a rotten orchard besides like planting new seeds and doing different to water those seeds. So thank you for that analogy, HT. And then kind of narrowing down from the national to a state level, how it manifests in the streets is what Governor Ron DeSantis just did at a state level with this priority legislation that he's proposing against protesters, that is very clearly an attack on Black people. Because when we see other major uprisings led by white folks, led by white women, we do not see this level of repression against those movements. This is in direct response to uprisings and Black Lives Matter. So we need to be very clear about that also. Bringing it back in to even our county and city levels, I looked up information about Hollandale. Sonia's here, Chief Sonia's here on the line, and we did work in Hollandale before your tenure with the family of Howard Bowe. So when we talk about what happened to Breonna Taylor in the no-knock raid, Hollandale was in the news also several years ago for a no-knock raid where a Black man was killed in his underwear, unarmed. And the family was just paid out hundreds of thousands of dollars for that no-knock raid. When there was a review of the Hollandale Beach Police Department and their practices around no-knock raids, they found that Hollandale Beach is about 80% white, But the investigation into the no-knock raids found that 33 of the 38 no-knock raids by the city's SWAT team carried out over a decade were done in one single square mile in a predominantly Black area. Howard Bowe was killed over $100 worth of cocaine and suspicion that he was dealing other drugs. Is that enough evidence for someone to potentially die in their homes? And then we have someone like Breonna Taylor that was a casualty of this violence and was sleeping in her bed. So these are the things that we see, the numbers that you presented in the PowerPoint before. Police violence disproportionately impacts Black people. It disproportionately impacts Indigenous people. And that right there is enough to talk about structural racism when Black people are not making up the majority of the population, but are overrepresented in juvenile arrests, overrepresented in suspensions from schools when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, overrepresented in jails, in drug arrests, and all of these different things where we know that Black people are not behaving any differently than any other population. Why are more of us being arrested? When you look at our protests, why does there seem to be so much repression on the street for protesting when it's Black-led or in defense of Black life? There's more repression for those things than the anti-maskers that invaded Target here in Fort Lauderdale a couple weeks ago to make people sick. Like, there's just so much going on that to me is blatantly right in front of you what we're talking about, exactly what we're talking about.
Let me jump in there for Gene, if you can, walk Chief Williams and Chief Quinones and folks, you know, I hope, let me just make a personal apology for Gene and myself. You do realize that any one of our panelists can talk for 4, 5, 6 hours on any one of these questions. And what we're trying to do is get this conversation jump started, give everybody a chance to give us that, you know, that thought spark. Because I hope you're going to call every single one of them afterwards and invite them to continue that dialogue in your circles. So, Gene?
Yeah, let me as I go to the two chiefs, let me show a video and then I'm going to go to the two chiefs, Chief Williams as well as Quinones. Show video number 2, please.
This is Jared Stephen Leone. He's 18. He's in City Hall in Beaverton, Oregon. And according to him, he's high on mushrooms. So he starts a fight with some cops. They all wrestle, and then Jared grabs a cop's gun and shoots it. More cops jump in. It ends up taking 7 cops 2 full minutes to restrain Jared, and he makes it out alive. This is white privilege. If that idea bothers you, then let's just call it benefit of the doubt. Those cops give Jared the benefit of the doubt that his life matters, that his life is worth saving, even when he takes one of their guns and shoots it. Now, of course, when you're Black, you rarely get that benefit of the doubt. Cops murdered Laquan McDonald in less than 30 seconds. Cops killed Tamir Rice in less than 2 seconds. But Jared, he got probation and a fine and just a bump on the forehead.
I showed that because this gives us an example of the reality. And I want to ask you, Chief Quinones, why is it that it appears that at the core of our problem is a devaluing of one life and a valuing of another? I can't imagine there's a person on this panel or in this audience that believes that a Black man doing exactly what that young white man did would not have been shot. He would have 100% been shot. Well, how do we know that? Because we've seen people running away from them to get shot. So taking the gun and shooting someone and still being coerced like that, and it's unbelievable to me. But how is it, Chief Quinones, that it appears there's just a different value of the lives in one community of color, devaluation, and in other communities, we need to be careful so we can sustain and give them another opportunity. Am I imagining that, or is there some reality to that perception?
And as you said, very important question, very important video, and great conversation today. It is difficult. It is challenging to have these discussions because as a law enforcement officer since '93, I'm going on my 28th year. It's crazy to think how time flies, but you know, I started law enforcement back in the day where just because a group of men were on a corner hanging out, we were told back then, hey, rookie officer, go out there and make sure they move along. And I remember that stuck with me because I'm thinking, why? What are they doing? They're not doing anything at that particular moment. They're just chit-chatting, hanging out, not doing anything. And that carried throughout my entire career, thinking that was not right. If they were doing criminal activity, then okay. So every situation is different. You know, I myself am Puerto Rican. I have been discriminated because I'm a woman. I've been discriminated because I have an accent, and so on and so forth. But when we look at videos like this, and I have to tell you from my own personal experience, if it depends on the situation, depends on what's going on. As law enforcement officers, I hope, and knock on wood, that I go the entire length of my career and never have to shoot my weapon at someone or forced to shoot someone or kill someone. God forbid that has to happen. And I treat myself differently. I ensure that our officers are held accountable, and it comes down to training as well. It's important that our officers have the proper training, education, and they're put through those different experiences and simulations that if they're more confident in their abilities, yes, we start with de-escalation. You know, I as a woman learned to, hey, I don't want to have to fight anybody on this panel. You all are strong, you're all healthy, you're all young. But if I can talk you down, make you feel like, hey, the best solution is let's work something out, then that's what we're going to do. But we know that at times the escalation just does not work. And that's why it's important to properly train our officers where they're confident in their abilities in physical training and defensive tactics, that I don't have to go for that weapon. I don't have to go for that taser or that asp or that pepper spray. And worst case scenario, I have to go for that firearms. But when we look at your particular video, it is awful to look at, awful in the sense of, here we have a situation, a lot of officers and one gun. And at that point, they felt that they were able to tackle that situation literally, but that officer, you know, hopefully nobody was injured as a result of the subject, but it's about working together, making sure we have the skill set, but we don't set out to, hey, because you're, at least I don't. And that's the culture I'm instilling in my guardians, because I do consider that's part of our motto. We're the guardians, the peacekeepers of our communities, to ensure that we do everything for the greater good, that we communicate with the public, that we don't have situations like happened in the past. I know Ms. Rogers Shaw talked about it's happened in the past, and those are circumstances that were unfortunate, and we don't want to have to relive those situations. But there's going to be times that force is needed to be used depending on the situation.
But one of the problems that we have is when we try, I really hope that when George Floyd's unbelievable tragedy unfolded in our face, that there would be an end point. But look at what's happened since then. Chief Williams, I ask you, I know the matrix of police use of force. I know de-escalation is supposed to be used, but you look at Youth Rice, who got killed in 2 seconds. The guy pulled up, boom, killed him in 2 seconds. Where was the de-escalation? Why is it the matrix seemed to be used? I know what's taught in the class, and I know what should happen. Why does it seem the matrix, we go to the most lethal force so quickly in certain communities?
Oh, well, thank you again for allowing me to be here today. Thank you, President Vaughn. Before I jump into that, there's a lot to this conversation. It's a little bit more than a policy. It's about the individuals' concepts in their mind of what they also are dealing with on the streets as well. I was asking myself when I was listening to all the great panelists talking, I said, was the conduct of the officer biased, or was the policy bias? I was asking myself that question. Was the conduct of the officer bias, or was the policy bias? Because if it was about the officer, then that's us trying to educate them. We have to teach them so that they can understand what's going on in the Black community, what's going on in the Latin community, what's going on out there that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. That is what comes back from the officer that's just coming out of the academy let me make sure I get this right. Forget what you've learned at the academy, because I'm going to teach you what is going really happening on the street. That concept is about them just trying to stay alive. That's all that concept's about. Now, whether or not the officer that's coming out has the same bias as the one that's teaching them, we know that there are two different constructs there. It's a paradigm shift that's happening in our community right now, across the nation, a paradigm shift. It's now awareness is coming now to not only how officers conduct themselves personally, but they also have to operate justly from policy, from Florida statutes. Well, speaking in Florida here, from our statutes and what's going on here with our elected officials and our collective bodies. We have to make sure that we continue the dialogue. I just got off another conversation about demystifying public safety and what is that about and so forth in conversation. My belief personally is that when we can teach our police officers all of the policies that this body, that the community puts together, but we also have to go outside of the square box and continue to have this dialogue with our community, because we have to educate the community also to make sure that they are following certain rules and regulations and so forth so that they can make it to tomorrow. Because these officers, they're human as well. And we have to make sure that they get the message, community gets the message, which then comes to a great conversation of learning about one another and understanding that there are racial barriers in there. But if you don't know what I've been through in life, then you're not going to actually treat me with that level of respect. And that we have to teach those officers fresh out the academy. And that's a learning, engagement. It's constant. The sheriff talked about it a few months ago. We had a press conference and we were talking about bias training and so forth and sensitivity and how we can push that out to all of our officers. In addition to that, I said, well, we ought to need to push it out to the community as well so that they can sit with us as police. When I say us, police departments, sit with us and teach us. I'm on a state committee, and that's exactly what we're talking about right now, trying to have the dynamic changes that are being called for, a rally cry from our community across this nation. And I think, Broward County, this particular platform is that starting point. So I commend, the Bar Association and President Vaughn for what you're doing, because this is exactly what I'm talking to folks in Tallahassee about every single week. We have a weekly meeting to discuss this, and this is the starting point. So I definitely appreciate that. I'll yield my time because I know we're—
on that one point, I'm sorry, Robert, just a quick follow-up. I commend you for the conversation. What's really important is who we put to the table. In this country, there is an effort to taint the name of Black Lives Matter. It's an effort to make it something that it's not. It's an effort to keep them from the table. This conversation couldn't, Ms. Roger Shaw, when I contacted her, we couldn't have this conversation authentically without her voice at the table. And I really ask all of us to make sure that we don't put to the table members of our choir or safe individuals, that we hear from those that may not agree with us to make us our best. So, as you raised the point.
Eugene, if I could just add, Rob, if I could just add something to what Eugene is talking about. Because he's most certainly right about that. I'm dealing with this right now. Okay, a few days ago, a little over a week, we launched the Social Justice Task Force here as a byproduct of listening to this community, hearing what they were saying, and acting upon their requests. That current Social Justice Task Force is comprised of roughly 21 members from across this community. We included to have members from the Black Lives Matter Alliance to participate in this. We opened it up to everybody. Now, out of all the different members that are participating on this panel, the one email that I continue to get from different segments of this community, the cries that I've heard from law enforcement officers was, why would you include Black Lives Matter? They are a terrorist group. They're extremists. That's nonsense. 21 different groups. No one's talking about any other group but Black Lives Matter. If we are going to be transparent, if we're going to have tough conversations, then we're going to have to include the populace that is being penalized and brutalized and murdered the most. It makes no sense. So as you can imagine, I'm not responding to all those emails because I don't have the time. But when I see them come up, I'm like, here we go again with the presumption and racism and discriminatory things that exist. And it's coming from the people who don't want to see unity.
So, and I would
Coming
say
from the people that don't want to face the truths, that if we're going to do this, I got to listen to Jasmine. Jasmine's been here. She's come with, she fired her missiles at me. I got my bulletproof vest on. It's okay. But if we're not going to have those conversations with the people that is impacting the most, we're wasting our time. I went a little bit more because that touched.
I'm gonna wait, Jasmine. Let me just do a little signposting.
Okay.
I'm gonna ask you to make your comment, and then I'm gonna ask Mayor Holness, and I'm gonna ask Captain Moss to jump in and talk about managing the balance between protest movements, legitimate protest movements like Black Lives Matter, and the contributions that they make, the baggage that goes along with those movements. And I'm trying to lay the question down so I don't have to interrupt. So I'm going to ask you all to police your comments, keep them judicious, but let's keep it moving. So Jasmine, please.
Yeah, so I've definitely fired missiles at many folks on this panel because everybody can get it in service of my people. I don't care who you are. And to that end, and I haven't had this problem with you as far as I know, Sheriff Tony, but to that end, if you all truly believe that Black Lives Matter is not a terrorist organization, stop surveilling our activists. Stop bringing your sound cannons to our protests. Stop tapping our phones. Stop holding files on all of us, because I've definitely been followed by cops all across this county, had undercover cop cars outside of my house. So if you truly believe that we have a voice in how we can make this county better, stop trying to follow us, stop trying to scare us, stop terrorizing us while we're going on about our day. And when Chief Williams just asked the question about, is it the bias in the police officer or is it the bias in the policy? It's both, to be clear. No-knock raids are a very biased policy that needs to be changed. The way we respond to things are so biased in who gets surveilled, whose events get surveilled. We see that in Miami Beach every single year with Urban Beach Weekend compared to the response to all these other music festivals that happen on the beach. So let's be very clear that both individuals and policies are biased. One of the questions that was in our outline for this conversation was, can one operate without the other? Systemic racism cannot operate without individuals that are willing to uphold that. They feed into each other. So it's absolutely both hand in hand. And then I also think that we can't be ignorant as if there's not models for how we can police better. There are other countries where police officers are unarmed. So let's not act as if we're inventing something new to try to keep people safe here in this country.
And I want you to hold on to that, because we are going to get to, so what do we do to address it? So don't lose that thought. But Mayor Holness, talk to us about that balance. Talk to us about how you have to deal with those different perspectives. And then Captain Moss, I'm going to ask you to jump in and tell us how you dealt with it in Ferguson after Brown.
So first, let me say this, that one of the big problems we have as a community and as a nation is we carpet these stuff over. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to face it. And I can tell you, being on the county commission, there are times when I talk about our policies as it pertains to how we deal with different communities. Some folks don't want to hear it. They rather pretend it doesn't exist. But let me say this to you, that if you're drunk, if you're an addict, if you have illness, if you don't admit that you have it, you can't cure it. So Black Lives Matters and other organizations like those are telling us, hey, here is the problem. We're sick. We're ill. We have issues. Let's face them. Let's fix them. We cannot pretend our way out of it. And we've done that for far too long. Covered it up. Hide from it. Don't discuss it. Marginalize those who would dare bring the issue up and for us to deal with. So yes, structural, systemic racism does exist, and finally we're acknowledging it. So we're going to have to fix it. That is where we really are, and it exists. It pre-made throughout our whole society in ways that you wouldn't even imagine. We did a training here that I brought in for our elected officials that had cameras in a kindergarten where educators were asked to look to see which kids were being misbehaved. They had a laser on their eyes that watched who they were looking at. They were looking at the Black kids. So guess who was misbehaving? The Black kids. Guess who got punished? The Black kids. That's why I'm likely to be stopped twice as a white person for not wearing a seatbelt. That's an issue that we need to deal with. We must acknowledge that we have a problem and then work to fix it. I know we can talk about the fix also, because even, let's say, Fort Lauderdale, 30 years ago, R.C. Hastings, when he was a judge, had a consent decree that was put together under him that they should increase the number of firefighters in that fire department to 20%. It's 30 plus years later, with a couple of black fire chiefs being there, and guess what? It's still less than 10%. And now the population is 30 plus percent. So there's a problem that we have to fix, and we got to find ways, and we got to be bold enough. And for me, the balance is, I'm going to speak truthfully. I'm going to speak honestly. I won't disrespect someone. I won't call someone names, but we have to deal with the issue, and we're going to deal with it. And whether you like me or not, whether you want to put somebody run against me next time or not, that's your problem. While I'm here, I'm going to do what I need to do that I believe is in the best interest of the people.
So Captain Moss, you actually left Florida to go and address this issue and deal with these balances and deal with protest movements, deal with reform. Give us your perspective.
Emergency.
Well, I think there are a number of things that have been said that I agree with here. You know, going into Ferguson was unique and interesting. I like the sheriff was an outsider coming in. And so I actually watch his career very closely because I feel like I need to protect him a little bit. Like Big Brother. But, you know, going into Ferguson, one of the first things that we did was we started a neighborhood steering committee. And that neighborhood steering committee had nothing to do with the police department. It was made up of people from all over Ferguson, in particular, people from the Black Lives Matter movement, because they had expressed the most grievances with that particular city. And one of the things that was unique about that was finding out how so many people lived within a 6.2 square mile city and had never ever sat down and had a conversation with each other, so that it was easy for them to deny the grievances of others. If you've never been discriminated against, if you've never felt the pangs of racism, it's difficult for you to understand that that happens. But that also brought me into law enforcement. But the first thing was to sit down and talk with everyone and to get everyone talking in the community. Also giving the community's input in terms of making policy and making those policy changes. But leadership was also critical. You know, when I was with the Miami Police Department, we averaged on an annual basis about 9 police-involved shootings every year for years throughout 12 of the chiefs that I worked for, 12 of the 13 chiefs that I worked for. One chief came in from New York, John Timoney, made a simple policy change, but in addition to the policy change, he changed leadership direction and the message he was sending. And we went 2 years without a single police-involved shooting. And that was, you're thinking that, you know, it was a stroke of luck, and you were thinking that it was all these things, but you realize it was leadership because just a couple of years later, 8 years later, you had the same policy and a brand new police chief. And we went right back to business as usual with regard to shooting because the messaging from the top was different. What you do as a leader, what you tolerate as a leader, you know, unions be damned. What you do as a leader, what you tolerate as a leader is what is going to permeate throughout that organization. If you want police officers to exercise that duty to intervene, then you got to make sure that you hold people accountable for that. If you want police officers to go out and serve a community without bias and prejudice, you've got to make sure that you are holding people accountable for that. You've got to send that the messaging starts from the top. The snake, you know, it rots from the top. So that's another thing, because as a chief, as a sheriff, you're going to always make decisions that are unpopular. And if you're not, you didn't come to work.
Exactly.
So you're going to always make decisions that are unpopular. But one of the things that we have to do in this whole thing is remember what our mission is. Remember what our North Star is and why we took this job. And make sure that we do it while we have an opportunity to do it. Because one of the things I knew as a police chief in Ferguson, even though I left on my own, one of the things I knew as a police chief in Ferguson, that's the only job that's temporary. That job is temporary. And your most powerful day is the first day. So you got to send that message clear. You got to send that message directly, and you got to send that message fast. And you got to make sure that you exercise and hold people accountable for that. I fired a lot of police, or I like to say I invited a lot of police officers to leave the Ferguson police and some took me up on that invitation, and some I escorted to the door. because they just weren't getting with the program. And so, you know, sometimes the best way to change people is to change the people. That has to happen sometimes, and that's part of management.
I want to invite us to have, you know, a conversation very briefly on something Gene touched upon, and it is this identification of a suspect or a threat perception. Now, that threat perception has two completely different perspectives. If you're on the street, it has one perspective, and then if you are in uniform, it has another. I've heard officers describe that you just don't understand the feeling when you're walking up to a car and the hair is rising on the back of your neck because you don't know what to expect. And then, of course, the perspective from the person sitting in the car, which is, you know, why am I being perceived as the threat? So HT, if you can, talk to us about the problem of this disparate or diverse threat perception. And then I want to pitch it to Gene to lead either Chief Quinones or Chief Williams or the panel through the other perspective. So yes, HT.
First of all, we start from the beginning. Police departments were started in America for one purpose: to prevent slave uprisings. They were afraid that slaves and the English would get together and fight the slave owners and get their freedom. In 1850, we passed the Fugitive Slave Act, where blacks were fleeing, and they had the police and increased the police forces for the purpose of going to find white slave owners' property all the way to Canada, if necessary, and bring them back. That's where the vigilantes came, and they began to work with the police. And then we had the rise of the Klan. I want those of you on the call to Google white supremacists and police. There's a report that just came out last month, because there's been a concerted effort by supremacists to infiltrate police forces all over this country. And one of the states is the state of Florida. Now, the President of the United States, Mayor Holness, they're powerful people. They cannot take a life. Lawyers, judges, lawyers can't take a life. Judges can't even take a life. Only profession where you give one person, male or female, the sole discretion. You don't need a committee. You don't need a motion. You don't need a second. One person can take another human being's life. That requires extreme vetting. We must be very, very careful. Just because you got muscles, you can run fast, and you can shoot a gun straight, should not be the minimum requirement for you to be a police officer. We need guardians. We do not need warriors who are infiltrating our community. In the 1970s, just before I began to represent the police, I started seeing on all of my police reports, murder cases, the words NHI. And I started investigating. We found out that the police, please, and don't take my word, investigate it. We found out that the police were putting NHI on the police reports in all cases where the people who were killed were Black. NHI mean to the police, no human involved. That came up, I'm sure that Pettis remembers this, came up in Broward County in 2007.
I see Michael nodding.
The chief judge of the criminal court, the prosecutor had lost the case and was all distraught, and the chief judge said to him, that was an NHI, all right? One of the main problems is because of the cultural incompetence of knowing Blacks, knowing whites, but whites as police officers, is that, in fact, they see all of us as threats. I got stopped by the police. I didn't have on my lawyer uniform. I got stopped by the police 7 o'clock in the morning going to play golf. I was going 50 miles an hour in a 40 mile an hour zone. That's true. Came up and pulled his gun. That's the kind of problem we've got to deal with. And as we saw the sadistic suffocation of George Floyd, that is enough to make prophets and angels cry. I'm not a prophet. I'm not an angel, but like millions of Americans, I cried too. We've got to change this.
Yeah, certainly. And this again goes to what we've been talking about, and that's how we devalue certain people and value others. Let me show a video clip to pick up on this, just because what we see then becomes undeniable. You can reject it, but it can't, it's real. Let's see the next video, please.
Roof, a 21-year-old high school dropout from Columbia, was arrested the morning after the massacre at the historic Mother Emanuel AME Church, which left 9 worshipers dead. Roof has now been charged for the 9 murders he has confessed to from his shooting rampage at a Bible study session. Charleston shooting suspect Dylan Storm Roof got a free meal from police on his way to jail. They went to Burger King. After about 16 hours on the run, the admitted mass murderer complained to cops arresting him in Shelby, North Carolina, that he was hungry, so police got him food from the nearby fast food joint.
I play that because there could not be a greater illustration of, and I can go through it more time. I mean, there's so many examples of how police approach the most egregious white suspect who just killed 9 and who injured so many at a prayer service. And they found dignity in that life to even feed him on the way to jail. Yet Black folk don't even get close to that. You rarely see them get even brought into custody. I know for a fact, because I represented law enforcement in different agencies, and I've heard guys say street justice. When it comes to Black folks, they think they got the right to give street justice. The Black guy doesn't even get to jail on so many occasions. I'm gonna, Chief Quinones, how do we deal with that? And I also want to hear from Mike Ducko, because Mike, you're here because you bring so many perspectives. You are an officer, you're an excellent criminal lawyer, and you're studying the area. So Chief, could you tell me first, how do we see this type of disparity where one is seen as a threat that we use as a threat, we label them as a threat, as a danger, and we use that to kill them? Another who is just as violent or more is cuddled and they brought in. And we see it here in Broward County. We see it all around the state of Florida, where violent criminals, white, are given dignity. Black guys who have done less are given the death penalty on the street so often.
So thank you for the question. It has to do with agency's policy. Again, we talk about policy a great deal, how we conduct ourselves, how we conduct our operations. I know for us, in our case, we have policy in place that if we're interviewing, interrogating an individual regarding a crime, at some point, we have to provide some type of sustenance. Doesn't mean it has to be Burger King or McDonald's or whatever the case may be, but it has to do with policy, because at the end of the day, we have to remain humane as well. We have to make sure that we treat everybody with dignity, the bad guy, the good guy, so on and so forth. So particular to that case, I don't know exactly what was going on in that particular case, but we have policy in place that we have to make sure everybody's treated.
Do you think if a guy had been on the run, just killed 10 people at a white church on the east side and had injured 10 or 15 others, and he said, "Officer, I'm hungry," what is the chance of him being stopped by whatever restaurant and given food? I'm just...
No, but again, it depends on the circumstances. I can tell you that if we just arrested you, no, that person's gonna have to wait. We have a process. We have to make sure we collect evidence, that we do everything, cross the T's, dot our I's, interview witnesses, whatever the case may be. This is after a prolonged period of time. We do have policies in place to make sure they have sustenance.
Yeah, well, yeah.
No, we're not stopping along the way to the jail to provide.
Right. That's what that illustration was, a stop along the way to provide before you've gotten it. And I'm aware of a lot of policies. We can't starve the inmates and the prisoners, but this was a little different. Mike, what do you have to say about that?
I think, Eugene, that one of the things that I think is important is to blend what Chief Moss said, what Chief Williams said with respect to enlightenment and training. We're at a point in our history, in our nation's history, and our community's history, where we need to stop and say, how the hell did we get here? And how do we fix this problem? And I think that starts with bridging the training, the young, impressionable, idealistic officers coming from the academy into the culture of the department. I think to Chief Williams' point, the training needs to be not just done on an individualized city by city basis or department by department basis. There needs to be some standardization. There needs to be some enlightenment as to what's going on. But I think policemen, police people need to realize the disservice they do. These examples that we've seen, the examples that you've shown, Eugene, the things we've read about, the things we see on the news, those are terribly disturbing, and we're all aware of that. But I don't know that that goes to the core of the conflict with police-citizen engagements in the community. I think that stems from discourtesy. I think that stems from disrespect. I think that stems from provoking confrontation as opposed to seeing the importance of de-escalation. Not every police-citizen discussion encounter on the street needs to be defended like a goal line stand. Sometimes there's honor in taking a step back and letting somebody voice their, I understand from the police standpoint, they're gonna say that's dangerous. You have to control the situation. But my point is, policemen need to be trained to be more aware of the voice of the community. I think that's that's more of an issue than just looking at a couple of the videos. The problem is you see that video and you realize there's clearly disparate differential treatment that seems to exist. And that's inappropriate. It can't. It's not right. It needs to stop. To the point earlier, just to Ms. Rogers Shaw made a comment about my comment earlier about not all policemen are racist. I stand by that, but my concern is many policemen, many good policemen are indifferent to the effects of systemic racism on what they're doing. And I think agencies, police administrations have policies in place with respect to quotas, measuring police performance goals that lend to people on the street sometimes taking shortcuts. And in the end, when the shortcuts are not being taken in my community in Western Broward County, the shortcuts are being taken in the predominantly Black and brown communities where it's easier and where they're less likely to be challenged on those things. And that's something that needs to be addressed. That's an honest assessment from a broad perspective of, I think, where the problems are.
Well, pun intended, let me play traffic cop. Get it? No?
Got it.
Okay, all right. Okay, we have just under 30 minutes. And there are two things I know we definitely want to cover. Gene, I know we want to talk about, in terms of addressing this problem. First, the issues of accountability and transparency and how problems are dealt with. And I'd like you to walk through with some of our panelists that question for about 15 minutes. And if I might, interrupt you, I'll jump in. But I know you want to talk about, for example, that Policeman's Bill of Rights and internal affairs. Why don't you walk us through that? Then we're going to spend about 10 minutes, and I'm going to offer a game time decision. I'm going to ask each panelist to just give us 1 minute of their top recommendation for policy changes, initiatives that we need to consider and implement, because otherwise we won't be able to get through it. So Gene, why don't you walk through that accountability and transparency?
I'll get started, Robert, and invite you to jump in. We're all aware of the Bill of Rights. We're all aware of the presence of the Union. We're all aware that this is a political juggernaut that requires, I think if there's ever to be reform, we're gonna have to deal with this. When you see the discrepancies that are in the Bill of Rights that provides for the officer who's been accused in sometimes the most obvious shooting that needs to be spoken to immediately, you see that he or she has the delay to get the entire record, to review everything, and to come up with what they're going to say in response. Whereas the citizen does the exact same act gets interrogated immediately. I mean, the discrepancies we see there manifest themselves in some of the disparate treatment that we see. I think it was Ms. Roger Shaw that spoke about what Governor DeSantis put out this week. I mean, I was so disheartened by how can we in 2020 come up with something so blatant as that? And if it never makes the level of law, to come from the governor's office to punish people for speaking out and and addressing their First Amendment right of assembly, and somehow how can we as people from law enforcement, let me flip it the other way, when we stay silent and allow a law to come into place to give you all and your officers the power, the burden to sit here and to look at an assembly and to start arresting people because one person was disorderly. Who are they going to fill the jails up with these first and second and third degree felonies? And think of the implications of that. When you're arresting people, taking them to jail, it's so many societal issues. How can law enforcement be a voice to let the governor know that's not the solution to what we need? And I'll start with you, Sheriff, and invite the others in law enforcement and to speak up on that.
Well, listen, Eugene, your sentiments are spot on and they're shared by me, all right? You looked at the totality of what that legislation does and the added burden that it introduces to us in law enforcement. One, there is a multitude of different legislative elements that are on the books right now as laws that gives me and every other chief law enforcement officer the authorities to do what is necessary to safeguard the public when we have protests and when we have agitators. So to compound that and add new elements in there, and even elements that incentivize people of less character who want to do harm to use their car as a weapon and then walk away with impunity. If you read that clause, all right? So my position is this: I am the chief law enforcement officer of Broward County. I represent the people of Broward County. That's roughly 2 million people. We've had protests in this community. We haven't had cars flipped. We haven't had an uprise of things where people were being overly hurt, harmed, or injured, or even killed in this community. I don't see it and I don't need it. And so we have to be honest about what's occurring with this, right? That is most definitely a political nexus to this agenda that the president has been pushing and sliding down here. Now, everyone tells me, Sheriff, you don't want to be, you're not political enough. And I push back and say, I'm focused on public safety. Well, this is a public safety concern. It is a public safety concern that, to your point, Eugene, what am I people to do? To go out and arrest 20, 30 people because of one person's antics and then create an influx in this jail where I already have 72% of the population of people of color? The more than likely the people who will be arrested under that particular legislation are going to be Black and brown people. So here we go again with establishing protocols, procedures that automatically have a systemic and institutional nexus to it, right? I think from a law enforcement standpoint, just as there were sheriffs and chiefs of police in the northern part of the state standing and rallying in support of this, we better most certainly have those sheriffs and law enforcement administrators that have like minds about the negative implications of this standing together.
Amen. Chief Williams, you're down here in South Florida, and you're right. The state is so divided. You got northern and you got southern, but how can we be silent and allow this type of thing? Don't the legislators, the public need to hear from those that say, this is not what we need in our toolbox. This is more divisive.
Well, thank you for the question. I think that's where we need to, again, I speak on the community having a voice. Standing out on the street corner, trying to rally your call, that's fine. We have to do that. But there also has to be some leadership on the other side, some infrastructure put together to ready to go to Tallahassee and have these conversations. I know we were trying to stay out of the political element here, but we all know that there is an underlying tone of politics that play in this whole arena here. We are treading very gingerly when we're trying to address, one, the politics of our community, and two, the public safety of our community, because we have to make sure that we address our community first. Our community first. Now, I'm looking at this, I'm like, I was showing the video, I was trying to keep tabs of everything that was going on. At the end of the day, any chief is going to be ashamed of any officer, in whether you're in Broward County or whether you're, you're in Minneapolis. We are going to be ashamed of the actions, especially if it wasn't in protocol, under the color scope of law. We do not, ascribe to that type of behavior and so forth. We have policies, we have foundations to stand on, and that's what we're trying to stand on when we're trying to deliver good policing to our community. Now, yes, is there bad apples in our community and policing community? Absolutely. But it's our job as chiefs to try to find them, to try to weed them out. And once we've observed them, as you see, the sheriff has spoken to that earlier, you eliminate them, you remove them. Now, this is where we come part two to this side of it. The sheriff removes them, then you have arbitration. Then we're trying to decertify them and do those types of things. That's where we need the help to get those folks out and keep them out. Because once I remove somebody, I've got to worry about that arbitration. I've got to worry about that officer going to now the sheriff's office or going to Hallandale to go work and do the same thing that they've been doing on the streets when I tried to remove them in the first place. And I honor Delrish and what he said, Chief Moss. He said it. Listen, I'm going to invite you to leave. But we also know when we do that, those same individuals that you invited to leave are stepping in somebody else's realm and completely destroying their communities as well. So we have to come together collectively and try to address this from the political perspective, because we need that change to come from the electeds and those individuals that are running, from Tallahassee's all the way down through our state.
That's a good point. Excellent.
We have it there. So, and I thank you for that. Let me yield my, because I know we're short. Thank you.
And City Manager Lagerblum, I know you're, some of this spills over into your realm, given that what you're in the process of looking who's going to be the next chief of police for the city of Fort Lauderdale. But we're hearing from here the relationship with the union, the bargained agreement that we have, which is a major anchor to deal with this. Chief Williams talked about arbitrations, and I've seen it. I've seen the hundreds of thousands of dollars that have been spent for somebody who should have been out on their backside 5 minutes, if not less. Had no place in public service, but we had to spend $100,000 to defend that point, which weighs in on the municipality. I've seen the union's imprint on this, in different cities, not any of you on this line, but the union's role in this and how cuddle union and the force is, which I think compromises independence sometimes. So in your job, City Manager Lagerboom, how do we create some independence? Because reform can't happen until there's independence, because the union doesn't want change, period. And that's not just police unions, that's teachers unions, every type of union. They don't want change. They want to be anchored just as they've been for decades. How do you lead us towards some reform at the same time change or modify that part of the equation? And I don't want to put you on the spot. You can talk globally, because I'm sure some of the things you're doing are ongoing, and I don't want to compromise you.
Sure. So no, thank you. No, I'm happy to talk openly and honestly. I think we need to be in a position where we are consistently looking at our law enforcement agencies and be willing to allow that look to happen from the outside in as opposed to from the inside in. And look at our policies and our practices and where are we in our alignment with good 21st century policing. I think we've got to be brave to learn the good and the bad, and that's some of the things we're doing here in Fort Lauderdale, where we will we'll open ourselves up to an external look, to look at our internal affairs policies, to look at our use of force policies, those things that are complaint generating and that often become the root of these issues. And you know, that in a partnership with external citizen review boards, I think there's a way to put an external look on our police department. We've started to invite the public and our review board members to some of the police training that's being done internal to the department, so that we've got this consistent interaction with the public and the police. But I also think we have to be just, you know, I started my comments earlier and I'll weave them into this comment as well. This is really about being brave and willing to do something that for so many years, decades, has just been easier to ignore. And, you know, I've got a decent relationship with our local police union. They know that, you know, I'm just as dig my heels in on issues as they might be on their issues. We do have certain laws that we have to follow, and we certainly respect those. But again, it's a shift in the culture, and I think that's where we've got to be brave and bold and willing to take that outside look and then implement what we learn.
Can I steal 2 seconds on that?
Certainly.
If I may.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to share because I'm literally one on this panel along with Chief Moss, who have dealt with this or has continued to deal with it. And this is almost just a professional courtesy to Chris. Chris and I, we've shared a lot of conversations together, and I had to build this culture and change it. And one of the key things, and I agree with what Chris had to offer and what he said, was the ability to absorb the political backlash that is going to come. Because what happens often is this union is going to fire their missiles. They're going to put the political pressures on your mayor to remove you as city manager, and all these realities are going to come. I've had a dozen plus letters sent up to Tallahassee on my watch, right? Because I was terminating people. You have to have the fortitude to endure the political pressures that are most certainly going to come your way when you are trying to take on corrupt police unions or individuals. And that's the key. Having strong leadership and making those decisions is essential, but you have to have the endurance. And I'll yield back.
Excellent point. Yeah, that's truth. I mean, that is the truth. Mr. Bond.
Yeah, I was going to take the opportunity. I'm going to just follow my ties, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give us 1 minute, whether that be an observation as to an issue we need to address, a suggestion as to a priority in terms of change or reform, whatever you want to do with that 1 minute. And in that time, Gene, I don't know if you want to pick 1 or 2 questions that have been forwarded to us, that if we have a 2 minutes after, you can lead the panel in that discussion, and then we close out. So I'm just following my tiles here. City Manager Lagerblue, you want to give us your minute?
Sure, it's interesting, I guess, where different tiles are on different screens. So yes, thank you for that. So yeah, I'll just conclude with a minute and saying that I really think we have an opportunity to make meaningful change both in Fort Lauderdale, Broward County, and in this country. And that's only going to happen if the dialogue does not stop. And I've said that before. And you know, I so appreciate being a part of a panel like this. I can tell you, I drove through Fort Lauderdale yesterday and I spotted a sign in a front yard, and it said, "All lives can't matter until Black lives matter." And you know, that's a point that I think is important, that we you know, that we do realize that Black lives matter. And it's just as important, and maybe even more so, that somebody who looks like me is ready to carry on that dialogue. And you know, I recognize that you know, there's people that are advancing you know, the discussion, and I certainly want to be a part of it. And I think we have real opportunity by being a part of it. So I thank this panel for allowing me to present today, and I hope that we make great change moving forward. Thank you.
Sure thing. Chief Quinones.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. So thank you very much again for the opportunity to be part of this great panel and great discussion. You're right, it's more than 2 hours. It's definitely could take 2 weeks, 2 months. It's been happening for years. So we definitely need to continue the discussions. I'm open. The most important thing is I'm committed. I'm committed to making sure that I'm that leader that continues to be that change agent, work with our community. We can't do this alone. I can't do this alone. I need a very strong team around me, which includes all our officers, all our professional staff, includes our community, having their voice. I've many times have sat before or come before a town hall meeting or a community forum or went to communities of the residents to talk about a particular case, whether it was use of force or something that needed additional clarification. I believe in being very open, very transparent, and together coming up with strategic, balanced approaches to how we can fix things. You know, we can sit here and say, yes, X, Y, Z needs fixing, but it starts with strong leadership, strong communication. And as we all know, we can talk all day long, but are we connecting? And it's ultimately about those connections we make internally, externally, and setting the tone. You know, we talked earlier about, you know, officers or bad apples doing the wrong thing or a bad orchard. It's about making sure that on our watch, on my watch, those things don't happen. It's not okay to do bad things. It's not okay to have bad behavior and get away with it. So it's important to be open, transparent, hold people accountable, and continue to the greater good. So I look forward to those opportunities to continue these discussions. I look forward to having additional conversations with Ms. Rogers-Shaw and her team and moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Dutko.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this program this afternoon. I think that I would start by saying anyone in this day and age who denies or does not acknowledge the existence of systemic racism in the criminal justice system is being blind or ignorant or perhaps both. It needs to be addressed. And although that impacts the entire criminal justice system, the most important point at which to start to address that, I think, is with policing. And I think that begins with enhanced training in that transition period from the academy into the culture of the department. And it can't just be directed at the new officer transitioning in. Administrators, police chiefs, elected officials need to realize that certain policies that exist within their department have an impact on the officers that are doing the work. They need to understand that measuring police effectiveness and productivity by the old standards of police performance and quotas doesn't exist anymore. We need to focus on more of a consumer satisfaction approach toward policing. We are at the crossroads of a new paradigm shift in policing. I think it's important to take advantage of it. And I would end with this. An old friend of mine years ago, Irish priest, used to say, Michael, no one of us knows as much as all of us. We all need to listen to each other. And I think that applies to this panel. I've heard some brilliant comments this afternoon. I think it applies to the community. We need to take that into the community, and we need to focus on expanding awareness and expanding a new approach in the paradigm shift as we go forward. Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear this afternoon.
Thank you, sir. Chief Williams.
Thank you. Thank you for this this opportunity. I'll be very brief with this. Try to. Number one, we are all on the same page, trying to build trust, legitimacy, transparency, and accountability in our community. Every chief, all law enforcement, we're trying our best to do that. The number one thing that I think that we have to do is learn about each other. And when I say we, I'm talking about my officers. I pulled a book off my shelf, and I wanted Chris to see this. This is Black and Blue. This is the Bible first. You got to learn that book, sir. And it's not just about me reading it. It's about my entire team reading it and understanding where it is that I stand in society, how they treat me versus how you treat me. But the difference is that I'm standing at the top, of the totem pole here. So you are going to have to go through with it, what it is that I am trying to push out to you. So you must learn what I'm asking you to learn. I presently sit on the Florida Police Chiefs Subcommittee for Accountability and Social Change. And one of the number one things that we pushed out, that we will be pushing out in the coming weeks, is a write-up, a full comprehensive write-up on the 8 Can't Wait initiative. We did not talk about that during this concept, but it is vitally, vitally important. And I called for all of the chiefs, in Broward County, that we would adopt and move forward with listening to these initiatives and to stop exactly what Mr. Eugene Pettis talked about folks in our community being shot. If we can't teach our officers how not to, pull a trigger when they don't need to pull a trigger and revert to other means of de-escalation or intervention when they need to intervene, then we're already starting off on the wrong foot. So that's one of the big points that we're pushing for Broward County, the A Can't Wait initiative. You've already pushed out the 21st century policing framework, those 6 pillars. Those 6 pillars start that conversation between the community and public safety. And if we can start diving deep into that, which is part 2 of this, of the committee that I'm on, we're actually dissecting each pillar frame by frame by frame. And if we got to add another pillar to it, we're going to do that too. It's just a framework. Everything has changed. It's like an evolution. Policing changes. So we're on board with it. I'm on board with it. And I thank you again for this particular panel and allowing the opportunity to speak today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It sounds like part 2 has been determined. Chief Moss.
I think it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg who said, real change, enduring change happens one step at a time. And I think that this is a great first step, one of many. I think that having this dialogue certainly brings enlightenment to me, because as a police, as a police chief, as a police captain, when you think that you're the most brilliant guy on the totem pole and you're giving away too many paychecks, you're absolutely wrong. So, listening to voices like Jasmine, listening to voices like so many who speak to what needs to happen, I think that is the first way that we're going to get to where we go in the future. Having been in law enforcement 36 years, I've seen a lot of good change. I've seen some things remain the same, but all those things that have changed make me hopeful for the future. And, we just have to keep pushing. That's all I have.
Thank you, Chief. Mr. Smith, sir.
Thank you very much. As a native Miamian practicing there, I've enjoyed the hospitality of Broward County, allowing me to participate in this conversation, which is not just a county conversation, not just a community conversation, it's a conversation for our country. I'd like to spend my time just talking for this 1 minute about solutions. One, extreme vetting of people who we give the authority to unilaterally take a life really needs to be a part of the gateway to get in. Secondly, we need to have a registry of police misconduct so that these good police chiefs don't have a problem with finding out somebody from Idaho coming in had 16 shootings or whatever. 3, we need to end the no-knock warrant. I was lucky Chief E. Wilson Purdy allowed me to do 2 things that most lawyers don't get a chance to do. He allowed me to spend a weekend in jail because I said, hey, I want to spend a weekend in jail. I want to see what it's like. I had to sign away all my rights though. And 2, he let me go on a no-knock, on a warrant, but it wasn't supposed to be no-knock. This is what happened. Knock, 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 police, ram. In other words, it was 3 knocks. 1, 2, 3, the word police, and the battering ram knocked the door down. There was no time. I mean, it wasn't supposed to be no knock, and it was a knock, but I don't think that's what the kind of knock they're talking about. Next, I think that we need to end qualified immunity. People need to know this. You can't protect bad conduct and get away with it. Next, we need to have civilian oversight. The argument about whether they need to be a subpoena or not, we can get into that. But if you are of the community, are you of the people and serve the people, how can you exclude the people? Next, we need to modify the police Bill of Rights. Police deserve rights just like everybody else. They should have a right to know the charges, a right to have a counsel, the right to have a representative, the right to know who's accusing them, they should have those rights, but they shouldn't be able to say, we need to get all the evidence and be last before we give our statement, and then be suspended with pay. On my side of the railroad tracks, that's called a vacation, or when you're suspended with pay. So we need to get rid of that. Lastly, I think that we need to, this is the first conversation, everybody on here is in the choir. What we next need to do is invite some people who don't agree You can't make peace unless you have warring factions. You know, peace treaties are not made between friends about nations that deal with each other. Peace treaties are made by people who don't agree, people who are fighting. And so thank you very much for allowing me to participate. And I look forward, either whether I'm participating or not, to a more creative tension conversation with people who will say to Michael, I don't believe in systemic racism. You can say they're willfully blind, or you can say they're not very aware of what's going on, but we need to have that conversation because trust me, I talk to people every day who say there's no such thing as systemic racism.
Amen. Ms. Rogers-Shaw.
So I've decided I'm going to take just a little bit longer than a minute because I'm only one of 2 women on this panel. I'm the only Black woman. Breonna Taylor is dead, and I'm mad as hell because she shouldn't be. So I'm not going to ramble, but I am going to take my time and be very intentional about this conversation. And a little bit of that is like letting you know who I am, because I feel like so many people come to Black Lives Matter activists as if we're refusing to engage in conversations or in this system. I have sat through fair and impartial policing trainings with police officers. I've been through multiple implicit bias trainings with police officers who refuse to sit and listen and even left the training early. I've been to the first day of police academy with police officers. So the perspective that I have is not just from in the streets, not just from community, but I've also had a lot of really hard off the record conversations with police officers, particularly Black police officers. I've studied police policy. I've worked in the Florida Capitol for years, talking to legislators and police officers about what's going on. So the perspective that I'm coming to is how do we reimagine public safety for everyone so that police officers can do the job that they need to do safely, but then also people that look like me aren't terrified every time they see a police officer or every time they have to engage the law enforcement system for something like a car accident or for a 911 medical emergency, that you're not terrified and debating your life before you make that phone call. Sonia mentioned earlier about the trainings and simulations for officers. I have also seen in these trainings where time and time again, officers are shooting unarmed Black suspects in these simulations more often than they're shooting the white suspects. So my question about what we can do about those things is, how are you identifying those officers early and taking the guns out of their hands and doing some either other deep training with them or telling them that they cannot be police officers with such an obvious bias that is going to kill people? What are you doing in your police forces to identify potential bias? I've also worked in child welfare. I was a child protective investigator for 5 years, having to go into people's homes and potentially tell them that their children were being removed and that they may be getting arrested. And all we were armed with was a clipboard and a pen. That showed me the value of de-escalating people on the worst days of their lives. And here I am standing before you, not having shot anybody, not having been hurt. So I know our police officers can do that same job. Again, there's examples from across this globe of police officers that are doing that job unarmed with less police involved shootings than we have here in this country. So when you ask about what we need to do, we need to defund the police. Police officers are tasked with way too much. Domestic violence cases, homelessness, mental health crises. That is way too much for officers to be dealing with. So what does it look like to, again, reimagine where we're putting our money and what safety looks like so that we have more services in our community, more services that can meet the needs of people and not criminalize these actions and put more people in jail and overwhelm our prison system, right? And I think law enforcement officers would agree with that they're doing way too much that they don't necessarily want to be doing or thought that they would be doing. Because that overextension on their job is killing people, that they are entering routine traffic stops with a heightened alert and killing folks. We need to talk about the Police Union's Bill of Rights, which H.T. Smith just mentioned, the fact that the power that we give law enforcement officers to participate in misbehavior perpetuates that misbehavior at every single level. The fact that Breonna Taylor was killed, George Floyd was killed, and there are still police officers drawing their guns to kill people when you know what will happen all across this country is disgusting to me. And then once we get to that conversation and address those things, this is the last thing. Once we get to that conversation, I think we can have a conversation about what it looks like to live in communities where we don't even need police anymore, where communities are tasked with policing themselves because they know best how to take care of each other, how to look out for each other, and how to be safe in their communities. So I would urge officers on this call to work yourselves out of a job and figure out what that looks like for the future.
It's painful to stop any of you, but you know, I hope you understand, and I appreciate your last words. Mayor Holness.
First, let me thank you for having me on, and I apologize for having too much work to do. I was on another Zoom for an hour. We issued an emergency order earlier today that we're getting some feedback from, and then while I'm on, you saw me took a call. The governor's office is wanting to open everything up. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of stuff going on. I'm grateful to be joining you. So policing is one part of the major disparity that we have in this country, in the criminal justice system. And it's costing us a lot of money if we look at even just that one piece. How is it costing us? And it's making us poorer, all of us, not just Black folks, but the whole country is lesser for it. We have less prosperity because of it. How comes? How do I say that? Well, listen, here's one. When you lock up so many people for minor stuff, you're taking their life out of productivity that they could be producing to make this country even greater than it is, more prosperous than it is. And then let's look at the real hard cost. The budget that we have this year, the $1 billion that we give to the sheriff office, $280 million of that is for jail, to lock people up, $161 a night. And sometimes for minor offensive that we really don't need to do. And then guess what? They get in the system and it gets worse. We don't allow them to come out and get to work. We take their life away from them practically for the rest of their life. You can't vote, you can't work here, you can't do that job, you can't live there. And it costs us more because there's more money we have to spend from our pocket as Americans. That's tax dollars that we put into the system that could be used to research the cure for cancer and to do so much more to make our lives better. So that's one piece that we need to address, and we need to look at it from that perspective in a great way. Yes, the disparity is huge. It's crazy. Blacks are 17% of the population, less than that, and 50% of people in prison in Florida. In Broward County, 65% of the juveniles that are arrested are Black, and we're only 30% of the population. Juveniles, kids. Imagine what it would be like if we didn't have that. And these young people can then have the opportunity to go to college, to go serve in our armed forces, to do so much more with their lives. So that's one piece of it. But let's look across the board also. Because if you're Black in this country, you're likely to not be employed as much as if you're white. Even when you have a PhD. If your name is Jamal or Lakeisha and you have a PhD, proven, not just me talking, proven fact, you're less likely to get a call back than someone who has a high school diploma that has a name like James or John. Just from your name alone, they haven't seen you yet. You don't have as much a chance. Now, we have to change that. Opportunities need to abound for everyone. When you look at contracting with government, when I got to the county, 10.25% of our contracting went to small business, minority, and women-owned business. And it was hard. I suffered some 8-1 votes when I came in, asking that we reduce the requirements in contracting opportunities, that we shelter markets for those who are small and minority and women-owned business. And we have a race and gender neutral system, okay? But we have a group called the CB, Certified Business Enterprises in Florida, that house most of those. And even with that lens, we're having problems. Today, we're 39%, but it wasn't easy. So it goes to this also, political will. Political will. And we, all of us, the white people on here, the Latinos, all of us join together and says, we will not tolerate this anymore. You will not use those tactics to frighten the community, to make us afraid of each other so that you can win votes to win an election so you can be in power. And I close with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And Mr. Sheriff, dare I say, your 1 minute?
Rob, I'm gonna play by the rules. Look, thanks for allowing me to come participate today and be part of this discussion. There's a lot of really good information that came out, some hard truths that are necessary. And I think we had the right administrators when it comes to leadership in Broward County from our law enforcement personnel. I know for a fact that the individuals here from Williams to Sonia to Moss and many others, that we're on the right track here. But the one thing I caution us all about is losing the momentum. We've had a lot of young Black folks die at the hands of law enforcement officers unjustly for quite some time. But there has never been the response that we are seeing as a byproduct of George Floyd's murder. And we are now having discussions. We are even taking more activity in terms of policy, reforms, reallocating money. But if this conversation stops, you most certainly better believe we'll be having this conversation again 10 years from now. So the challenge is to take this tragedy and ride the momentum till the wheels fall off. As my mother used to say, ride it till the wheels fall off and put forth all the things that we can. I'm the chief law enforcement officer of this county. Half this county falls under my protective care and custody. What the mayor talked about, $280 million in this jail, is most certainly true, but that didn't happen overnight. And this has been a long-standing problem here that is going to take time and tenure to fix. I'm optimistic, but I'm also not naive to think that this is a short-term fix that can happen under my next 4 years, God so be it, or any other 4 years from that. You don't fix hundreds of years of racism, systemic problems overnight. And so we're planting seeds right now. We're planting seeds. They're going to have to be nurtured. You're going to put some fertilizer down, put some water down to make sure that we, at some point, bear a fruit that we can eat and live with. I'm going to do my part. One thing that you really wanted to hear was a closing argument about what is the one key thing that we would say, recommend, or push forth from a policy change. I can handle my agency and our policies here. We'll continue to handle it. But the help I need is how are we going to change the arbitration process, which so often handcuff us as law enforcement administrators, the one who have the courage and fortitude to step out and do what's right. What Chief Williams talked about is a continuation of problems that we all have. The courageous administrator that says enough is enough, and then all of a sudden we get this person back in here. That's outside of our purview. For my legal minds in here, that's the battle I need you to fight for me. I'll do my part. That's something I would say is fundamental. Lastly, Rob, I've coined this little phrase here with my staff and with my deputies. We can't afford to be a profession of courageous cowards. We can't be the guy that's willing to run into a building and shoot it out with an armed suspect, but we won't have the same courage to say, hey, this is wrong. You can't just slam young Black people on the ground. You just can't jump out on them. You can't beat them up, right? So that same type of temperament and mindset applies to everybody in this room and everybody who's listening. I think you got 89 participants still here. You can't be a courageous coward. If you're gonna fight for justice, fight it. Take the gloves off and go. But this is not a spectator sport, because if you think that if your skin color, you're white, you may have privilege, you may have wealth. If you think it don't impact you, you are most certainly wrong, because the paradigm has changed. When these injustices occur in a Black community, it's not burning down the Black community anymore. Finding their way on Las Olas. We're all connected in this. We're all invested in making sure that justice truly exists for everybody in this country. And so thank you for having me on. I will most certainly be back. I say, let's do it 2, 3, 4, 10 more times. And I wish everybody a good weekend and a good evening.
All right. Gene, we have to make another game time decision. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a quick comment. I'm going to ask you to close us out. You've seen the comments. You're going to talk to us with the final word. And I'll say this to everybody on this call and everybody paying attention. It was never our goal to answer all of the questions and to be able to provide all the answers in one conversation. We knew with this deeper bench, we wouldn't be able to go deep into any one answer. I hope you have made a connection. I hope you have taken the name. I hope you've gotten a taste of the level of depth of thought and conscience that our panelists bring to this discourse, and you invite them into your dialogue. I hope that you take the suggestions to have continued conversations on qualified immunity, gender and policing, police training, 8 can't wait, 21st century policing, data regarding police misconduct, civilian oversight, modified police bill of rights, and the arbitration process. These are all conversations that can spur this dialogue and discussion for panels just like this. Our next Enlightenment through Engagement discussion is actually going to be on criminal justice reform on October 30th, 2020 between 12 and 2. Mr. Pettis, I can't tell you how proud it's been to have served on this panel with you. And why don't you close us out, sir?
Thank you so much, my friend, and really appreciate your vision, Mr. President, for pulling this together. I'm going to hold the questions. We have some very interesting questions, but we're going to have to incorporate those questions into the next session because I think it will be doing it injustice to run through some of the questions. How we're, and Mrs. Rogers Shaw touched upon it, how we're interfacing with people that have psychological issues, why we're putting police officers in a place that so often we end up with injury and deaths when they shouldn't have been the one to respond to in the first place. The role of money, but one of the things we've not touched upon, and I've been doing this through Can We Talk dialogue series through the Tower Club, in conjunction with the Tower Club, is bringing the business community into this conversation, because we have to make sure that the coverage that the sheriff was talking about, the community standing behind these bold and rightful initiatives, the business community is standing with us. I know Mr. Larga Bloom has been there with me. He was on a panel with me at the Tower Club. There are some good corporate citizens. We need to bring them into this dialogue so that we as a community can do the right thing. I'm 60 years old last month, and I've born and raised every one of my years here in Fort Lauderdale. I am hurt that we're still having some of these conversations that I remember as a kid growing up here. But this is what has been visited upon us as our generation, and every single bit of my influence, connection, network is on the table to do better. And I know these esteemed panelists have networks. We should be talking about this not with this choir, but every table that we're at, with our white brothers and sisters, with not just at home. We all need to be talking intentionally, honestly about this, because it's only going to happen when we take it into the conversations in the broader community. So the next panel we pull together is going to have some of you, but it's going to have some additional faces here, because we do need to have that conversation that HT spoke about with people that don't agree with us. We can't run from that. We have to invite that, because it's only through hearing the other perspective that we will move and be enlightened, as will they. And we're going to come to a point that we can coexist, as to a point of ignoring each other and allowing this friction to continue. I can't be happier with the conversation that we've had, but this is a beginning point as opposed to a close of a chapter. And now that we know better, we should use this, the impetus, to do better. So thank you all for your time. Thank you for letting me be a part of this. And I commend the panel for a job well done. Thank you, guys.
The resources are on the BCBA website for those of you who want to reference some of the material that the panelists talked about. Their bios are on the website, and we will save the chat and try and see how much of that we can make available in terms of the questions that were asked. Thank you all again. Sorry for being late. Have a wonderful weekend.